The time has finally come to talk about a game franchise nobody really hates, and its last edition, Doom: The Dark Ages. Pretty fitting name considering the current state of the gaming industry, I must say. In a way, it's also somewhat of a hint as to what my opinion about this game is, but before I start jumping to conclusions, which I know most of you do given my video's like to dislike ratio, I first wanna say that I enjoyed the game as a means of entertainment. However, Doom: The Dark Ages had one too many issues I couldn't just close my eyes to and pretend this is a great game, because it clearly isn't. With that out of the way, let's see why the newest id Software creation isn't Doom. As usual, I'm gonna commence with the positives, and there are quite a few. The first and most obvious of the good aspects is the gameplay loop. Much like every Doom entry, the Dark Ages is pretty unrelenting, and it will never render you bored no matter how much of a thrill junkie you are. 90% of the time you're offloading bullets in pretty much every direction possible. In a lot of cases you'll be spamming abilities just to stay alive, for the enemy density in certain sections of the levels is so high that bullets just don't cut it. You do have little breathers between tense encounters and objectives, but the way this game was designed is that shortly after a massive shootout you have to head over to another congregation of monsters for the item you need to get your hands on or destroy in order to progress through the campaign is somewhere amid the fray. Even in moments of calm, there are certain activities you can do to fill your time, like for example, you can look for objects that are essential for unlocking weapon modifications and buffs. Most of the times those items are well out of reach or locked behind doors and you have to solve some kind of a puzzle to grab a hold of them. In terms of weaponry, namely firearms, there's a decent array of guns you can toy around with. I'm not gonna list every single weapon since I don't wanna make this review sound too robotic and dry, but despite not having the exact same lineup, in Doom: The Dark Ages there are equivalents to some of the weapons present in previous games, like for example the BFC, which is the crossbow version of the BFG 9000, the Plasma Accelerator and Plasma Cycler are obviously meant to replace the Plasma Rifle, and I'm not gonna lie, the Plasma Cycler grew on me pretty fast. I found myself using it quite often considering how easily it gets rid of energy shields. The other gun from that category even had some recoil to it, which was a rather nice touch. And to no one's surprise, the most iconic demon disposal device, the Super Shotgun, is yet again an inseparable part of our character's arsenal. The new additions like the Pulverizer and the Ravager look pretty cool, and I was excited to use the hell out of them, but as someone whose playstyle prioritizes precise aiming over wide projectile spread, the Skull Crushers weren't really my thing. That being the case, I like the designs, and they definitely fitted the sort of Executioner Chamber vibe all of the levels had. Unlike in Doom Eternal, where you have one weapon per slot and you switch between two different fire modes, in the Dark Ages you can have two different weapons per key so long as they are of the same class. Additionally, each weapon has its own perks, but you can only use one at a time. You can't cycle between weapon features on the go. In order to change the weapon's behavior, you have to visit a Sentinel Shrine, and if my memory serves me right, there should be at least one per level. Speaking of Sentinel Shrines, they act as your upgrade benches not only for firearms and melee weapons, but also for the newly introduced shield you now have to carry throughout the whole game, and trust me, you're bound to use that shield a lot. As you've probably already noticed, Doom: The Dark Ages distinguishes itself from the previous games in one main aspect, which is blocking incoming enemy attacks is now an essential part of the gameplay. The red and purple projectiles are logically to be avoided, whereas the green ones can be deflected, and upon parrying they can stun the enemy, giving you a bit of time to recover some health, armor, or just to take a few free hits on the attacker. Protection from demon surges and shots isn't the only thing your shield is good for, because you can also use it as a secondary mid-range weapon by throwing it at walls of other enemies, thus eliminating multiple threats in one go. The same goes for the lunge attack, and you can even embed it in the bodies of stronger opponents to temporarily stop them in their tracks. The shield is also a rather good armor breaker, with the only caveat that the armor piece must be incandescent orange before you're able to crack it. On top of being a rather decent murder tool, the buckler now helps you in traversing the maps by acting as a grapple hook. You just have to find a torso cut in half with green goo oozing out of it, throw the shield at it and pull yourself up using the chain attached to your fender. The blood punch has been brought back along with two other options for blunt attacks, a flail and a mace, with the latter having the slowest recharge time, but also boasting the strongest hit out of all three. Much like every new age Doom game, you can perform finishers on the enemy, and as always they look pretty sick. I did enjoy how there are stronger versions of non-boss enemies. Leaders are easily recognizable by the small icon floating above their character model. Upon defeating one of those, you receive a permanent increase of ammo capacity, health, or armor. Champions are enemies covered in gold plates, and being harder than a coconut, they're pretty annoying to deal with. Also, they don't really give you any specific bonus or items apart from 80 HP upon death, so I consider them less exciting to fight than leaders. Now, the enforcers are definitely among the better types of special enemies in the game, and their gimmick is spawning reinforced enemies and resurrecting them if they get killed. In a way, they act as the archviles in the first 3 games, but what's different now is they don't necessarily incinerate you if you stay too long in their field of view, since each and every one of them has their own attack based on the type of demon they are. The best monster encounters in my opinion, however, are the leaders with a morale meter. They're essentially enforced heavy class demons with an impenetrable shield around them that you have to whittle down by killing other demons that spawn in the same area, and after depleting the purple bar, the leaders become vulnerable to stun and physical damage. Towards the end of their morale, the game will throw at you stronger opponents like cyber demons and komodos as a final desperate attempt to protect the chief. Morale encounters give you the same buffs as when you defeat an ordinary leader, but to me they're even better when it comes to the sheer mayhem that ensues after triggering a fight. As for new enemies and also reoccurring ones, there were a number of redesigned original characters like the Revenant, which in Doom the Dark Ages looks more like a wraith rather than a mechanically improved skeleton. There's been some changes in the cyber demon's design as well, with one of those alterations being pretty noticeable. The new rendition possesses wings which only appear to serve a decorative purpose. Still, I can't deny that I was actually a bit surprised at the beginning, and in a way somewhat worried as I was imagining how much of a pain a flying cyber demon could be. The soldiers and the imps didn't manage to escape the brush either, but the most eye-gouging out of all redesigned enemies was without a doubt the Pinky. Actually, I don't think I've seen a quadrupedal Pinky since Doom 3, and to be fair, the rider on top combined with the much more slender build of the animal didn't help in making it easy to recognize in the slightest. The new additions were represented by the Imp Stalkers, the Agadon Hunters, Battle Knights, Kaku Demon hybrids, which are clearly a mix between the Arachnotron and the Kaku Demons, Komodos, Acolytes, Cosmic Barons, and Titans, the last one of which can only be fought while piloting the Atlan or Atlan, not sure what the correct pronunciation is, but basically the huge mech you have access to during certain levels. Out of all new demons, the Nightmare Imp Stalkers were the most fun to fight since they can go invisible, and the only thing you see before they attack you are a pair of glowing eyes and a barely discernible transparent body, but since you don't carry any light source on you, if they catch you in the dark things can get real interesting. Funny thing is, the actual boss fights, where the enemies have stages, not just huge hell bars, didn't happen until the last 3 chapters of the campaign, and given the fact that the story mode is divided into 22 parts, I thought it was a bit strange at first that the strongest enemies I'd fought so far were probably just mini-bosses at best, or simply highly specialized heavy class demons. Even so, the only 3 bosses I went up against gave me a pretty good time, with the exception of the old one. I really couldn't get into the kaiju combat, to be fair, it's way too slow for me, but I appreciate it as a means of breaking up the repetitiveness of the missions. I also got to beat Azric's ass twice, and the second time we raised our fists against each other, the battle ended up with the Doomslayer repetitively bashing the Demon Prince's skull with the flail. Not gonna lie, that scene was pretty good, and the cinematic timing was flawless. It was just long enough to make me excited, but also short enough to not feel weird. Honestly, kudos to whoever was involved in the making of this clip. Some chapters were relatively short, and others were about an hour long, give or take. The layout was varied enough, and I heard some people were concerned that the more open level design might actually be a bad call by id Software, but honestly I don't think the levels were that horrible or samey for that matter. The very fact that your character moveset is pretty much reduced to running in a single jump, and you still have parkouring sections, swimming levels and straight up jet fighter chases says more than me trying to convince you that the few League of Legends types of map layouts are not representative of the majority of the environments. But if you don't think what I say is true, there's always playthroughs you can use to prove yourselves wrong. Anyway, in terms of activities, my favorite mission by a long shot was From Beyond. I absolutely loved the dragon flights and the Hellfighter hunts. There was a pretty good chunk of boots on ground action too. Frankly speaking, that particular level went by a lot faster than I wished it did. Spire of Nerthul was also pretty decent, and the Sentinel command station was sort of like a throwback to the old games, where we had a lot of closed off areas, corridors and even some vents action. It's one thing to fight bullet sponges in an open area where you have a lot of room to move around and improvise, but trying to fight them in small spaces is something completely different. Chapters 15 and 16 were aesthetically the most pleasing levels, heavily leaning into that sort of HR Giger art style. By the way, Giger is the correct pronunciation, not sure why people call him Geiger, botching his name every single time, but anyway, moving on. In chapter 16 you can also find one of the coolest puzzles in the game, where you rotate a room around its axis in order to get to a huge gold deposit. Additionally, you have to be mindful of the planar tilt so you don't mess up the jump from the geometric shape you're standing on to the platform in the center. Another cool area was the entrance to the tunnel that leads nowhere, and it's safe to say the game threw me for a loop there. A number of levels had environmental hazards like fireballs, platforms that can crush you to death, some kind of tank-like war machines. They even brought back the tentacles from Doom Eternal, but now they're surrounding a much bigger version of them, which immediately remind me of Don't Starve Together. I would actually be surprised if the developers came up with that idea on their own, because the whole setting is a bit too specific to be a coincidence. One last thing before we move on to the negatives. Prior to creating a save file, you're being presented with the 4 standard difficulty modifiers from the previous entry in the franchise, plus 2 new permadeath game modes, only suitable for people who are sick in the head. Both of them give you the nightmare experience in terms of how hard hard the enemies hit, with the second one being the most unforgiving, offering no recourse to continuing your run after you die. While I was playing, I was constantly shifting between Ultra Violence and Hurt Me Plenty just to see how they stack up next to each other, and I have to say Ultra Violence can definitely give you an aneurysm if you're tired or just not in the mood for a more uncompromising gameplay, whereas Hurt Me Plenty is pretty much the sweet spot for people who can shoot straight, but also aren't too keen on sweating their lives away against NPCs. And if you look at it realistically, there's nothing to gain from beating a single player game on the hardest difficulty. Nothing's at stake, you can't even insult or taunt the opponent over chat. At least in multiplayer games, when you're first or second, you can get some kind of a reaction from the other team by teasing them with get wrecked or losers, I don't know, anything that comes to your mind that you're certain will piss someone off, especially if they have a negative kill-death ratio. That's why I was never able to get why hardcore single player enjoyers pop such a huge boner after completing games on the hardest difficulty. You're literally competing against nobody. But anyway, I don't want to turn this into a single player versus multiplayer face-off. You do you, speedrun the game, do no damage runs if you so wish, I just don't get the appeal honestly. Now it's time for the part you've all been waiting for. The segment of the review where everyone poops their pants while trying to convince me how a mediocre game is a masterpiece, then presses dislike and scurries away in a corner crying their eyes out at the thought of honest reviewers simply existing. Doom: The Dark Ages is a modern game through and through, and that's clearly displayed by all the accessibility features, the atrocious bloated menu, the UI with the compass at the top of the screen, all the quest marker pointers, as well as the constant tips popping up mid-battle, pausing your game and trying to teach you stuff when the only thing you want from a game of that nature is just good action that makes you go full tunnel vision for a few hours. Tell me honestly, what's the point of choosing a difficulty setting and then modifying the modifier? Do you even realize how stupid the fully customizable experience is when you look at it in a vacuum? Imagine sitting at a table with a friend for a cup of coffee and you start talking about your experience with Doom: The Dark Ages. Then at some point you bring up the ages-old question, what difficulty did you beat the game on? And he says, well, I chose Nightmare, but I also increased the parry window to large, disabled the enemy aggression and gave myself 500 HP. Yeah, and I beat Magnus Carlsen in chess on Ultra Nightmare, but before I did that I lowered his IQ to 80, disabled both of his hands and cured his autism. It's plain ridiculous, and I think the difficulty sliders are among the worst aspects of Doom: The Dark Ages. As I've already mentioned, the tutorial windows were a big gripe of mine, and they were particularly annoying in the first 2 chapters. After that you see them less often, but even if you collect all weapons, the game won't stop with the tips, for there are also shield runes that you pick up well after the halfway point through the campaign. And of course, much like with the guns, you get a short explanation as to how those runes work in the form of game pausing cues on the screen. I'm also well aware that you can turn off hints, but the fact that they are on by default means that this is now the standard. It means that developers no longer view you as a problem-solving conscious being, but just the average brain-dead consumer who spends half an hour pressing buttons trying to figure out if you can holster your gun in a game where this isn't an option. That same person who needs tips because otherwise the game would be too hard for them and they would ask for a refund. This is why I hate modern games interface, and I wish gaming never became mainstream, but hey, I guess all good things must come to an end at some point. Sadly, the end of my favorite entertainment medium happened way too early, but I digress. Anyway, now regarding something I would have normally pegged as a positive, the physics were definitely a lot more prominent than those in Doom Eternal. However, simply touching wooden structures makes them collapse on the ground as if they're built from empty matchboxes. And now this was most likely done intentionally to put a strong emphasis on how powerful the Doomslayer is, but that's just not it. I think there's a fine line between badass and comically stupid, and the developers definitely crossed it. The movement was something that's been bugging me since the release of Doom 2016. And I'm not necessarily talking about the mechanics of it, since pretty much every iteration of the game after Doom 3 and its DLC Resurrection of Evil offers more traversal options such as climbing over ledges, wall scaling, double jump and such. I'm simply saying that jumping and strafing peaked with Doom 3 in terms of how they feel. Like for example, in the 2004 release, you can press and hold any of the directional keys and chain consecutive jumps while also strafing left or right. And that's a viable way to go from point A to point B, mind you. In the new age Doom games, pressing A or D while jumping is absolutely bricked and you can't go further than a tile at a time. Compared to the movable objects in the last 3 games, the ones in Doom 3 had a lot more weight to them and didn't feel like they were made out of aluminum foil. Furthermore, you could use barrels or boxes to climb on top of shelves and grab medkits or ammo, but you always had to be mindful to not push them too close to a corner, since there was no way for you to move them again if they wedged themselves between 2 walls at a 90 degrees angle. And all of that and more you had to figure out by yourself. There was no in-game in-game tutorials, no corporate coddling, everything in older games felt more personal and honest. Developers used to respect and acknowledge your intelligence. They treated you like an actual human, not just the average value on a spreadsheet. Not to mention that during combat your screen can get absolutely littered with all sorts of particle effects, directional arrows, muzzle flashes, broken armor pieces flying everywhere, demon surges, and sometimes you can barely see what's in front of you, so you kinda have to go by instinct in moments like that. Can't say that I view this as a major problem, but it's without a doubt a trait of modern gaming. Another dead giveaway that you're playing a contemporary title is the eradication of setting uniformity and faithfulness to the art direction. I've talked about this in my previous review, you can give it a watch if you haven't already, where the artists blend together ideas from vastly different worlds and time periods, like for instance, magic coexisting with science, or medieval mixed with highly advanced technology. And I'm aware that the first non-fully 3D Doom games were pretty silly when it comes to lore and backdrop, but you also have to understand that the 1993 Doom was never thought it would become as successful as it did. The people who made the game tried to create an entertaining shooter first, and then they slapped a couple of paragraphs serving as an explanation to what's happening in the game and who you're up against. The narrative in Doom 1 and 2 wasn't meant to make sense to begin with, but rather give young boys a little bit of food for their imagination. Doom 3's creators had the grueling task to take those few paragraphs from the previous entries and turn them into a fully fledged story that had to make as much sense as possible without compromising what's already established. Did they succeed in doing so? Absolutely yes. They used potential near-future tech, a portal to hell was opened, the UAC base was invaded, and you were left with no other choice but to kill. Simple and effective. There was no energy polearms, knight's armor, obscure pompous souls-like writing. Every single aspect of the game with the exception of the supernatural stuff they couldn't scrap anyway was cohesive and complemented the setting they had created perfectly. I believe at some point you'll be interested to know if the game is buggy. Personally I won't say it's super polished, but I also don't think it's terrible. In fact, I can overlook certain things like clipping through walls and finding holes in the geometry, leading to me exiting the map in a more unconventional way than just completing the objectives. The real reason why I chose to include the bugs in the cons section is because there are also some pretty annoying game breakers, like getting stuck in loops where the level keeps spawning fodder enemies and refuses to unlock the hatches or doors you need to go through after completing certain events, which in theory should trigger the next stage of the level, but that's only in theory. The matter of the fact is you can spend hours just training your aim by shooting zombies in the head, but no matter how many of them you kill, the poorly coded script won't let you proceed anyway. You either have to roll back from the last checkpoint, or sometimes even start the level over. The music could have definitely been better. There are a few tracks that sound like actual metal with some linear double bass patterns and snare hits on the downbeat, but pretty much the whole OST used the quintessential gay metalcore guitar spaghetti string tuning, and yeah, you can piece together the rest. Truth be told, I was never a big fan of the Doom soundtrack, but one thing the first and second game excelled at in terms of musical content was making catchy 8-bit tracks with actual hooks. Are they something I would listen to in my time off? No, but still that doesn't change the fact that they were significantly better than the pseudo metal in the last 3 games from the franchise. Now, is there DEI in Doom the Dark Ages, and if yes, how much of it they've managed to shove in it? Simple answer, yes, there's an immense amount of wokeness in the game, and you're being exposed to it right from the start. The first and most obvious sign is all the African NPCs on the planet Argent and Nur. For some reason only like 10% of all NPCs were of Western European descent, and I'd like to think that this wasn't done on purpose, but my gut feeling says otherwise, and believe me, I have a pretty good intuition when it comes to that type of stuff. Surely white people would have gone with the stone castles, wooden kiosks and gothic statues better than black dads and Indian hussies, but who am I to judge? Setting plausibility no longer matters, guys, so embrace the suck. Mrs. Manjaw was our resident Mary Sue, and up until the point she appeared on my screen, I thought David Coulthard held the record for the most robust mandibula, but I guess I got proven wrong. She also happens to be a commander, because you can't have a strong female character be any less than a sergeant. Of course, our girl is also one of the strongest, if not the strongest characters in Doom the Dark Ages, since she's a descendant of the gods that came before the makers, possessing copious amount of wraith energy. And since I've already spoiled a bit of the lore, I think this is a pretty good time to try and summarize the story of Doom the Dark Ages. You're being teleported to the planet of Argent and Nur, where the population, or the so-called Sentinels, are fighting against waves of demons. At first, the Sentinels throw you into the Colosseum, where you prove yourself to be worthy of joining their ranks. In the meantime, the Makers, or the highly advanced alien race you obliterated at the end of Doom Eternal, is putting their eggs in 2 different baskets, siding with both the Demon Prince and the Argents. And since they need astronomical amounts of fuel to sustain their existence, they stock up on wraith energy, or the power of Argent and Nur's dormant gods, while also using Hell's essence collected from the tortured souls of the same people they get wraith energy from. Due to his abilities and incredible aptitude for slaying demons, the Doom guy eventually obtained the highest rank an outsider had ever received. He became a Sentinel Knight. During one of the raids of the Hordes of Chaos, they send a Titan-class monster even the Doom guy is unable to stop, so one of the Sentinel priests decides to install a device into the protagonist's body that significantly increases his speed and power. With the newly acquired strength, the Slayer manages to defeat the giant monster, thus becoming a hero Argent Denur. Turns out this contraption is also part of the Maker's technology, which tethers the protagonist to Creed's will, turning him into a mindless weapon. Unable to fully contain the Doomslayer's rage, the Makers finally come to terms with letting him go unsupervised, for he is still useful to them as a means of protecting the energy mining facilities of their vassal nation. Meanwhile, in the Demon Realm, Azric is dead set on finding the Heart of Argent, which will give him and his minions the upper hand in the war against the Night Sentinels. And as I've already divulged, Mrs. Manjo is indeed the power source Azric is looking for. Not long after the Demon Prince discovers her potential, he abducts her and starts using her to his advantage. From that point onward, the Doomslayer sets out on a mission to retrieve her and also kill Azric and his treacherous little pawn Creed Maker. And yeah, that's basically the skeleton of Doom the Dark Ages story. Obviously there's more lore and details surrounding different characters, but if you've been following my channel long enough, you probably already know that I'm not a lore buff. Story is important, but I believe the narrative shouldn't be half of the video or even nowhere near close to a third of its length. With that being said, I believe some of you might be curious as to why the plot of Doom the Dark Ages didn't make it into the pros, and I have a very good explanation which is also tied to the very title I chose for this review. It's time to unfold why Doom the Dark Ages isn't Doom. I think the last two games from the franchise destroyed pretty much everything a game like Doom 3 had built by virtue of heavily leaning into the phantasmagorical world building. You take a look at an image from the Dark Ages or Doom Eternal, and you're wondering where and when the events are taking place. Are you on Mars, Earth, or maybe an alternate dimension? Are you moving forward or back in time? What's next? Is it the Mesozoic era or is it 3.5 billion years from now? Nobody knows. You stare at uncertainty and turmoil. Now have a look at a picture of Doom 3 and tell me what you see. I see the near future. The hope of people to one day terraform Mars while still fixing leaks and replacing capacitors in a facility that's barely meeting their needs. I see a clear direction. The direction of forward, while still recognizing props from the century I was born in. Even in Doom 2016 I could discern a clear path. The path of futurism. Now tell me what's the appeal of wine barrels and torches alongside holographic control panels and weapon drop pods? I'll answer that for you. None. Another thing people seem to forget is that every Doom iteration up until the release of Doom 2016 was a horror game. Surely the first two Dooms might not look as scary as they did back in the day, but the fact that the 90s games had so many horror elements like super dark areas where you had to rely on your muzzle flash, enemies popping out of hidden compartments next to you, strong demons locked up behind exit doors serving as jump scares, invisible creatures hiding in the shadows and many more are a testament to how Doom 1 and 2 weren't just first-person shooters, they were action horror games. Doom 3 was incredible in the way it handled the fear element and fully embraced it, so much so that it left an enormous footprint on the 2000s tunnel shooter scene. Up until 2009 you could see elements from Doom 3 in pretty much every horror FPS game, to the point that it became what Dark Souls and Bloodborne are now. Everyone's trying to emulate their gameplay and writing style. Doom 3 was much darker than the previous entries. It was gritty and unsettling in its presentation by running the player through tight corridors with enemies spawning behind you while screeching at the top of their lungs, imps being more agile and elusive than they'd ever been, commandos knocking you back with an attack that's nearly impossible to evade unless you crouch. There were also baby demons called cherubs, monsters that were definitely the precursor to the Dead Space crawlers, as well as loads of spider-like enemies crawling out of vents and holes in the ceilings. The bosses were also pure nightmare fuel, especially the Sabaoth and the Vagary, who looked like disabled people with pale leathery skin and only one wish: to kill. There were no health bars, tips, none of that existed, which made the encounters even scarier because you were unaware of how long it will take you to get rid of the beasts. Are you gonna have enough ammo to finish them off? Do you even have the proper weapon or projectiles to deal with them? This is horror. Seeing blood everywhere, glistening like freshly spread strawberry jam is not scary, it's comical. There's no more feeling of being isolated, you're no longer worried that you'll suffocate if you stay too long outside, and to top it all off, you cannot even kill friendly NPCs. 2004's Doom is to my knowledge the only game from the franchise where you can kill innocent people and also essential to the story characters. That's why I believe Doom 3 is without a question the quintessential Doom experience. Unlike the last three games who completely got rid of the fear factor, the 2004 release not only adopted the horror, it took it to new extremes. Even the main character has now morphed from a human marine to some kind of a demigod who's able to take care of cyber demons in less than 30 seconds. Back in the golden age of gaming, the Doom guy still had vulnerabilities. You could see his avatar on the bottom of the screen getting progressively worse the more damage he took. In Doom 3 you had to be vigilant around every corner so you don't get one-tapped by a soldier, and you even get saved by a search and rescue team after you defeat the final boss. And look, I enjoy power fantasies as much as everyone does, but the idea of playing as an invincible force of nature able to fight its way out of purgatory upon the thought of demons walking the earth's surface is just stupid, and I hate it so fucking much. I enjoy the times when enemies weren't just walking health and armor piñatas, the times when you had to find and manage supplies yourself, or even roll back and repeat a manual save in order to enter the next section of the level in a better condition than before. In contrast with the classics, the new games force you to play a certain way, which is different than playing smart. Don't confuse one for the other, because that's very important to understand the point I'm trying to make. Playing smart is getting the most out of a particular encounter by being careful and focused, while still retaining the ability to brute force it if you wish so. Being forced into a certain playstyle, however, is the game telling you how to defeat specific enemies by prompting you to use the right types of projectiles, or timing your counterattacks based on the NPC's behavior. And if you decide to do things your way, guess what? You simply can't. The color-coded attacks that you have to avoid or deflect, combined with the art direction of certain levels and all the ARPG types of items like gold, raystones and rubies, made Doom the Dark Ages look more like a first-person Diablo mixed with Beat Saber than a Doom game. I believe the franchise lost its identity with the 2016 release, when they got rid of the horror aspect and transformed it into Apex Legends with all the saturated colors, vibrant environments and advanced movement mechanics. And yeah, while I do agree that the last game took a step back from the zoomer color palette, it still is a modern game from top to bottom. Do I think Doom the Dark Ages is bad? Actually no, I think as a shooter game the last addition to the franchise is pretty decent. Is it a good Doom game though? I think you already know the answer, but no, absolutely not, and this video proves it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the review, you could give me a like, or a dislike if you hated it. Drop a comment and maybe subscribe to my channel if you fancy actual reviews from a real person, not some corporate puppet with an expensive camera and a room full of Funko Pops. With that said, stay awesome and we'll see each other at some point this summer, not sure when. Anyway, I'm out.